There is something many people carry into the night. Not physical tiredness, not the ordinary weight of a full calendar, something quieter than that, a tightness somewhere in the chest, a low, steady hum of effort, the sense that you have been holding something up all day and cannot quite remember when you started. Maybe you know this feeling. The version of yourself that shows up for the world, composed, capable, ready to handle things. And then, the moment the door closes, the car parks, the lights go low, something in you exhales. And you realize you were holding your breath all day. Tonight, we are going to sit with that exhale. Not to fix it, not to analyze it, not just to understand it, because there is something important in that gap, the gap between the person the world sees and the person who is here now, in the quiet, a little tired, a little uncertain, wondering if they are doing this right. You are not alone in that wondering. A researcher named Brené Brown spent more than a decade studying human connection. She began with a question that seemed simple. What makes some people feel deeply loved and like they truly belong? And what makes others always seem to be reaching for that feeling without quite arriving? What she found changed the direction of her work entirely. And it starts here, with the armor, not the dramatic kind, not shields and war, the quiet kind, the kind most people never see. The careful way you phrase an email so no one can tell you are uncertain. The laugh that arrives a moment too fast, covering something real. The habit of being helpful before you can be hurt. The way you turn a question back to the other person before anyone can ask how you are actually doing. We learn these things early. Most of us cannot say exactly when, but somewhere, in some ordinary room, in some ordinary moment, we learned that certain parts of us were not entirely safe to show, that certain feelings were inconvenient. That being seen too clearly was a risk not worth taking. And so we built the armor. And here is the quiet thing about armor. It works. For a while it works beautifully. It protects. It keeps the cold out. It keeps the soft parts safe. But armor is heavy, and you feel that weight most clearly right now. At the end of a day, in the dark, in the moment after the performance is over, and you are finally allowed to be the version of yourself that is just tired. There are two kinds of tiredness. Most of us only talk about one. The first is the tiredness of the body. Long hours, not enough sleep, too much asked of you physically. The second is something harder to name. It is the tiredness that arrives after a long time of being something for other people. After carrying the composed version of yourself through a day that never once asked how you were actually doing, tonight we are going to sit with the second kind. We are going to understand where it comes from, what it costs, and what might become possible if, just for tonight, in this quiet space, you let the armor rest beside you instead of around you. Let your shoulders drop. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. There is nothing to hold up right now, nothing to perform. And somewhere in the hours ahead, something may loosen. Something that has been held carefully for a long time may begin gently to rest. Hold that thought gently. It becomes clearer as we go. Chapter 2, A Life Behind Performance. Think of the last time someone asked how you were doing. Really asked. Not the passing greeting in the hallway, not the reflexive exchange before the meeting. Someone who stopped, looked at you, and meant it. What did you say? Most of us say something manageable. Fine, busy, getting there. Could be worse. And the strange thing is, we believe ourselves, or we believe the performance enough that we stop noticing the difference between what we feel and what we say. This is what a life behind performance looks like. Not dramatic, not dishonest in any obvious way. Just shaped, carefully shaped around what the world seems to want from us. You became good at something, and the world rewarded you for it. So you kept doing it. You learned to be calm in a crisis, and people leaned on that. So you kept being calm even when you were not. You learned to be the capable one, the steady one, the one who does not need much. And slowly, without quite deciding to, that became the role. Not a mask exactly. Just the version of you that got the most positive response. Think of a man in his early 50s, 26 years at the same company. He is the person people come to when something goes wrong. He fixes things. He knows the systems. He is steady. He cannot tell you the last time he told someone he was struggling. Not because no one would listen, but because somewhere along the way, being the one who holds things together became the thing that gave his life its structure. And the thought of showing the seams, the anxiety he carries on long drives, the low feeling that arrives on Sunday evenings without explanation, feels like it would unmake something essential. It is not weakness he fears exactly. It is more about identity. We become our performances. Not all at once and not on purpose, but gradually, in the small daily choices to show the smoother version, the better version, the version that requires nothing from anyone, we drift a little further from the full picture of who we are. And there is a cost to that drift, not a dramatic cost. Not something you can point to and say, there, that is where it went wrong, more like a slow distance between the self you present and the self you carry quietly inside. And sometimes, late at night, you feel that distance most clearly. It is not loneliness exactly. You may be surrounded by people who love you, people who believe they know you well. But you wonder sometimes that if they know the version you show or the version you actually are. The body knows this question even when the mind refuses it. Notice how your breath moves right now. Notice if anything tightens when you sit with the idea of being truly seen, because that tightening is not a flaw. It is information. It is the body remembering something the mind learned to manage around. And the thing the mind learned to manage around is where we are going next. Not quickly, not dramatically. But there is a word for the space between your armor and your actual self. We will get to it. For now, just notice the way you learned to perform, the reasons that made sense at the time, and the low, steady hum of effort it takes to keep that going every day, year after year. That hum is what we are listening for tonight. Chapter 3. What vulnerability means. Here is what the word vulnerability has come to mean in most conversations. Weakness, exposure, the state of having left yourself open to attack. It is used as a warning. Do not be too vulnerable. It makes you a target. It makes you look like you cannot handle things. And so most of us have spent years, quiet, efficient years, keeping it at a careful distance. But the research Brené Brown spent more than a decade building tells a different story entirely. She began, as many researchers do, with a question that seemed manageable. She wanted to understand connection. What creates it? What breaks it? What allows some people to feel deeply loved and belonging, and what leaves others always slightly outside that feeling, pressing against the glass? She interviewed people, hundreds of them, then thousands. She sat with their stories, read their journal entries, looked for the patterns beneath the patterns. And what she found was not what she expected. The people who felt most connected, the ones with the deepest relationships, the strongest sense of belonging, the most genuine feeling that they were loved for who they actually were. These people were not the ones who had found a way to be invulnerable. They were the ones willing to be seen, not completely, not recklessly, but enough to let real connection actually land. And the quality that made that possible was not confidence, not success, not having everything figured out. It was a willingness to show up without guarantees, to say the true thing when the easier, safer thing was right there. To reach towards someone knowing they might not reach back. To be in the room as your actual self rather than as the polished performance version. Think of a woman sitting across from a therapist for the first time. She has a list. She has done her research. She is prepared to be efficient about this. The therapist asks one question. What would you say to yourself right now, the way you would speak to someone you love? The woman opens her mouth and stops. She realizes she has no idea. She has spent years knowing how to speak to other people with warmth and patience and care. She cannot find a single word of that language to direct at herself. That moment, that quiet stop, that small and honest recognition is vulnerability. Not because she was falling apart, but because something real and undefended was in the room. And here is what makes this significant. Brown found that vulnerability is not the path to connection. It is not one ingredient among many. It is the birthplace. Connection cannot exist without it. Not real connection. Not the kind that makes you feel less alone in the world. Not the kind you look back on and recognize as the thing that mattered most. Because connection requires being seen. And being seen requires the willingness to show what you actually are. This is also the birthplace of creativity, of joy, of love, of the feeling that your life is genuinely yours. Here is the small detail that changes everything. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the most accurate measure of courage available. When you say the true thing, when you reach towards someone with no guarantee, when you stop performing long enough to actually be present, that is not a failure of strength. That is the hardest thing most people will ever do. And here is something worth pausing on before we continue. Most of the moments of vulnerability that change people's lives, in Brown's research, in every story of genuine connection, were not grand, they were ordinary. They happened in kitchens and cars and quiet conversations at the end of long days. They were the things said when someone finally stopped managing long enough to say the true thing. I am struggling. I do not know what I am doing. I miss you. I was wrong. I love you, and I am afraid. These sentences are short. They require no particular eloquence. They are available to anyone at almost any moment. And they change everything they touch. Not because they are magic, because they are real. Because the person who receives them knows in the body, before the mind processes it, that what they are being given is not a performance, it is a person, the actual, unmanaged, unarmored version of a person who decided that this moment and this relationship were worth the risk. That decision is courage in its oldest form, and it is exactly what we are going to sit with tonight. Let your jaw soften for a moment. Let the next breath move on its own. We are just beginning to understand something worth understanding slowly. Chapter 4. Shame in the quiet mind. There is a feeling that goes by many names. It shows up when you make a mistake, and the first thought is not, I did something wrong. The first thought is something worse. Something is wrong with me. It is the difference between those two sentences that Brené Brown spent years trying to map. And the difference, she found, is everything. The first thought, I did something wrong, is guilt. And guilt, while uncomfortable, is actually a useful signal. It says, that action did not align with my values. It invites correction, apology, repair. The second thought, something is wrong with me, is shame. And shame is a very different animal. Shame does not invite repair. Shame does not point toward a specific behavior you can change. Shame attacks the self. It says, you are the problem, not what you did. You. And this is why Brown calls shame the most powerful, most primitive human emotion. More than fear, more than anger. Because shame attacks the thing we need most, the sense that we are worthy of connection. She describes shame as the fear of disconnection, the fear that if someone truly saw this part of you, this mistake, this inadequacy, this hidden thing, they would not stay. You would not be worthy of love and belonging. Every person carries some version of this. Think of a night where you cannot quite name what is wrong. You are in the dark. Nothing happened today that would explain this feeling. And yet, there is a weight, a quiet, settling heaviness that is not sadness exactly, not anxiety exactly, just a low, persistent whisper that says, "You are not enough." Not enough for what? The mind does not specify. That is how shame operates. It is not attached to a single event. It is a general indictment. And the quiet mind, the mind at rest, the mind no longer busy enough to drown it out, is where shame speaks most clearly. This is why the night gets loud. Not because anything is wrong with your brain, not because you are broken or unusually troubled, but because the daytime gives you distractions, tasks, responsibilities, the noise of being needed. And at night, when all of that goes quiet, what has been waiting patiently in the background finally gets the room to itself. What it says to you is familiar. You know its voice. You may have been hearing it so long that you mistake it for your own, but it is not your truth. It is a learned thing, a shape you were given before you could question it. And here is what Brown found in the research. Shame grows in silence, in the dark, in the unexamined space where it is never challenged and never named. The antidote is not cheerfulness, not positive thinking, not telling yourself you are wonderful. The antidote is language and connection and the slow, careful practice of bringing the feared thing into the light where it can be seen for what it actually is. There is something worth adding here before we continue. The research on shame resilience is not asking you to perform vulnerability. It is not asking you to overshare or to make your struggles the centerpiece of every conversation. Shame resilience is quieter than that. It is the practice of having at least one person, sometimes only one, who knows the full picture, who has been given access to the less polished version, who has earned the right to hear the real thing and has demonstrated they can hold it. Brown calls this a shame-resilience connection. It can be very small. One person qualifies, and the existence of that one person, that one relationship where the armor is not required, changes the entire interior landscape, because you are no longer carrying everything alone, because the feared thing has been said aloud and received, because the body knows, in at least one context, what the absence of performance actually feels like. And that knowledge becomes a reference point, a reminder available in the difficult moments that the real self is not just survivable, but lovable, not theoretically, in the lived, felt, experienced sense. That reference point is one of the most valuable things a human being can have, and it begins with one honest conversation, not a verdict, not a life sentence, just a feeling. Just a very old, very human fear that has been mistaken for a fact. Let your breath slow for just a moment. Notice if there is anywhere in your body that holds this, not to fix it, just to know where it lives. Because the first step toward loosening shame is simply noticing it, naming it, saying, "There you are." And we are doing exactly that tonight. Chapter 5. The Fear of Being Seen. There is a moment that happens in close relationships sometimes. Someone looks at you, not casually, not in the easy social way. They look at you in the way that sees past the composed version, past the performance, into something more specific and more real. And something in you wants to step back, not because you do not want connection, but because being seen that closely is the very thing you have spent years learning to manage around. The fear of being seen is not the same as shyness. It is not about crowds or public speaking. It runs deeper than that. It is the fear that if someone saw you clearly, the uncertainty beneath the confidence, the sadness beneath the capability, the tender and unresolved places you keep carefully off to the side, they would find something that falls short, that the real you is not quite enough to justify the love that has been given. This is one of the most common fears Brown encountered in her research. Beneath the specifics, the different stories, the different people, the different details of each life, a single thread kept appearing. I am afraid that if you really knew me, you would leave. And the response to that fear is armor, performance, the careful management of what gets seen and what stays hidden. Here is where it becomes complicated. Because the armor works. It prevents the very thing you fear. If you never show the uncertain places, no one can judge them. If you never admit the struggling, no one can use it against you. If you stay one step ahead of vulnerability, you stay one step ahead of rejection. But something else happens too, something you may have already felt. The armor that keeps the pain out also keeps the connection out. You cannot selectively shield yourself from rejection and still be fully available to love. You cannot protect yourself from being seen and still feel truly known. The wall that guards the tender self also guards against the very thing you most want. This is the central paradox of protection. Think of two people who have been together for many years. They sit in the same room evening after evening. They are comfortable, they are safe with each other. But somewhere along the way, without either of them quite deciding it, they stopped being fully present with each other. Not because they fell out of love, but because the years taught them which topics led to discomfort, which feelings caused friction, which parts of themselves were better kept off stage, and so they show each other the managed versions. And they wonder, sometimes, where the closeness went. It did not leave in a single moment, it left in the accumulation of 1,000 small decisions to show less. But there is a body awareness in all of this. And that is what makes this more than just philosophy. When you are with someone who allows you to be fully seen, who does not flinch, who does not withdraw, who stays, you feel it in your body. Something loosens, something that has been braced relaxes. That relaxation is not nothing. It is the nervous system registering safety, real safety. Not the managed safety of performance, but the actual safety of being known and not found wanting. Notice the weight of your body right now. Notice if anything is held. That holding is not failure. It is a very old, very reasonable response to a world that sometimes confirmed the fear, but the fear is not the truth. And we are going to spend some time tonight sitting with that distinction. Because on the other side of the fear of being seen is something worth finding. Not perfect safety, but something more durable than that. Think of what it means to be truly received, not just to be in the room with another person, not just to be liked or approved of or included, but to have brought the actual thing, the uncertain thing, the struggling thing, the thing you were most afraid to show, and to have had it received with warmth. The experience of that is different from every other kind of positive response, because every other kind of positive response is for the performance. This one is for you. And the difference registers in the body before the mind has processed it. There is a quality of relief in it that is different from ordinary comfort, a kind of settling, the nervous system exhaling from a vigilance it had been maintaining for so long that it had stopped feeling like vigilance and started feeling like simply how things are. That settling, that specific loosening of the defensive readiness is what becomes available on the other side of the fear of being seen. You are still yourself. The imperfections are still present. Nothing has been fixed or improved or made perfect. But you have been seen as you are and not found lacking. And that experience, however briefly, however imperfectly held, changes the baseline. It becomes evidence that the fear was measuring something different from the actual risk. We are getting closer to it. Chapter 6. Scarcity and Never. Enough. There is a particular quality to waking up in the morning in the modern world. Before the first thought is fully formed, before coffee, before the day has made any demands, there is already a quiet assessment happening. What did I not finish yesterday? What is expected of me today? What am I still behind on? What is still wrong? Brené Brown calls the culture that produces this scarcity, and its central message is one of the most damaging ideas quietly running in the background of most people's lives. Never enough. Not thin enough, not rich enough, not successful enough, not productive enough, not patient enough, not present enough as a parent, not ambitious enough in your career, not calm enough, not happy enough, not grateful enough for what you have. The list does not end. That is the nature of scarcity. There is no finish line. There is no morning you wake up and the assessment finally says, sufficient. And here is where it becomes personal. The scarcity message is not just about things or status or achievement. At its deepest level, it is about worthiness. The underlying question is not, am I doing enough? It is, am I enough? And that question, Brown found, is exactly the soil in which shame grows best. When the culture's baseline message is that there is never enough time, never enough money, never enough proof of value, then the self becomes subject to that same accounting. And the self almost always comes up short. This is worth sitting with, because most of the internal critics that arrive at night are not original. They were not invented by you. They were inherited from a world that measures worth by productivity, by appearance, by achievement, by how well you manage to keep all of the plates spinning. A woman in her mid-50s reached a professional milestone she had been working toward for years. The announcement came on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, she woke up with the same low feeling she always woke up with. She had been so certain that this achievement would change the morning assessment, that the quiet accounting would finally come out in her favor. But the scarcity message does not work that way. It adjusts to the new level. It finds the next insufficiency. It is not satisfied by achievement, because achievement was never really the point. The point was the belief that something was missing in her, and achievements cannot fill a hole that was dug by a belief. This is not a problem with her ambition or her intelligence. It is a problem with the framing. When you come from a place of never enough, nothing is ever enough. Brown found something different in the people she called wholehearted. They did not live in a state of scarcity. They were not naive about difficulty or failure, but they operated from a different starting assumption. Not that everything was perfect, not that they had arrived at some state of completion, but that they were enough, that they were worthy of connection and love, not because of what they had achieved or produced or managed, but because they were alive and human and here. Something changes when you stop trying to earn your way into belonging. We will get to what that looks like in practice. But first, we need to sit with the inheritance. Because you did not choose the scarcity message, you absorbed it the way you absorb any culture, through years of immersion without knowing it was happening, without being able to consent. Let the next breath be slow. Let your hands soften. You are not behind tonight. There is no assessment being run here, just this. Just the quiet, just the beginning of understanding something that has been running in the background for a very long time. Chapter 7. The Inner Critic at Night. Everyone knows the voice, not a literal voice, more like a tone. A presence that settles into the mind in the quiet spaces and starts reviewing the day. The thing you said that landed wrong, the task you did not finish, the moment you reacted when you had promised yourself you would stay patient, the way you looked, the way you sounded, the way you still cannot seem to get this right. The inner critic is loudest at night, and this is not an accident. During the day, the mind is occupied. There are tasks and conversations and decisions. The noise of the external world provides a kind of cover. The inner critic is still there, but it has to compete. At night, it has the room to itself. And so what managed to stay quiet during the busy hours, the low-grade worry about whether you are doing enough, being enough, measuring up enough, comes forward into the silence and starts talking. This is one of the reasons so many people reach for their phones in the dark. Not because they need information, because the stimulation creates competition for the inner critic's airtime. But here is what Brown's research adds to this. The inner critic is not neutral. It is not a wise advisor offering honest feedback. It is almost always speaking in the language of shame. And the difference matters enormously. A wise advisor would say, that conversation could have gone better. Here is what you might do differently next time. The inner critic does not say that. It says, you are the kind of person who always messes this up. It says, this is who you are. It says, other people do not have this problem. It says, something is fundamentally insufficient about you. That is not feedback. It is an attack. And the cruel thing about the inner critic is that it has been at this long enough that its voice sounds like yours. You cannot always find the seam between your thoughts and its commentary. Think of lying awake at around 2 in the morning. The mind replays a moment from earlier in the day, a short exchange with a colleague. Something small. And the replay does not stop at what happened. It begins to interpret that tone they used, that slight pause before they responded. And then the mind builds a structure around these small pieces, a structure that says, you are not respected, you are not valued. You are behind in some way that others have already noticed. And none of this is necessarily true, but the 2 in the morning mind does not fact-check. It speculates. And when it speculates in the language of shame, the speculation feels like evidence. Here is what to notice. The inner critic gets louder when you are depleted, when you are tired, when you have not had enough of the things that restore you, when you have been performing for too long without any space to simply be. It is not a moral assessment, it is a weather pattern. Exhaustion and shame travel together. This does not mean you are broken, it means you are tired. And tired things need rest, not review. Let your shoulders drop, let the voice be there without having to answer it. You do not need to argue with it tonight. You do not need to resolve it, you just need to recognize it for what it is, a very tired part of you that learned to speak this way before it knew any better. There is another language available. We will find it together. Chapter 8, Perfectionism as Protection. Here is something that surprises people about perfectionism. It is not about high standards. That is the story perfectionism tells about itself. I just have high standards. I care about quality. I want to do things well. But Brené Brown's research draws a sharp distinction between the healthy pursuit of excellence and perfectionism. And the distinction is not in the outcome, it is in the motivation. The healthy striver is motivated by the work itself, by growth, by the satisfaction of doing something well. When they fall short, they adjust and try again. The shortcoming is about the effort, not the self. The perfectionist is motivated by something else, by protection, by the belief, quiet, rarely examined, extremely powerful, that if they do everything right, if they are excellent in the ways that matter, if they manage to present no flaws that can be criticized, they will be safe from judgment and from shame. Perfectionism is armor. Specifically, it is armor against the feeling of not being enough. If I am perfect, you cannot find fault with me. If I am perfect, I am safe from exposure. If I am perfect, I have earned my place. And this is why perfectionism is exhausting in a way that ambition is not. Because ambition is pointed outward. It is energized by a goal, by growth, by the pleasure of moving towards something. Perfectionism is pointed inward. It is powered by fear, by the constant vigilance of managing every detail so that no judgment can land. You cannot sustain that kind of vigilance indefinitely. Think of a woman who has spent her career preparing more than anyone else in the room. Her presentations are flawless. Her reports are thorough. She arrives early and stays late, not because she loves the work, but because she is terrified of being caught without an answer. She is recognized as excellent. She is promoted. She is admired. And she is exhausted in a way she cannot explain to anyone, because from the outside it looks like she is thriving. But the exhaustion is real. And it has a source. She is not working hard in service of something she loves. She is working hard to stay one step ahead of the fear that she is, underneath all of this, not quite enough. The perfectionism is not the solution to that fear. It is the symptom of it. And here is the quiet cruelty of perfectionism as a strategy. It can never succeed in what it is actually trying to do. No level of achievement can permanently silence the inner belief that you are insufficient. Because the achievement was never the point. The underlying belief was. And beliefs are not moved by results. They are moved by what Brown calls shame resilience, by the slow, patient work of recognizing that your worth was never actually up for review, that you were enough before the presentation was flawless, that you are enough right now in the dark with nothing to show and no one evaluating. Let that idea sit somewhere in the body for a moment, not as an instruction, not as something you need to believe fully right now, just as a possibility. Because once you see what perfectionism is actually protecting against, the protective structure starts to feel less necessary. And what comes after that is something much lighter. Brown draws a distinction that is worth carrying. Healthy striving asks, how can I grow? What is this teaching me? How do I do this better next time? Perfectionism asks, what will they think of me? If I fail, what does that say about who I am? The first question is pointed toward growth. It comes from a place of engagement with the work itself, with the genuine desire to do well. The second question is pointed toward judgment. It comes from the surveillance mode, the constant monitoring of how you appear, what is being concluded about you, whether the performance has been sufficient. And here is what makes that distinction so significant in practice. The healthy striver can rest. When the work is done, it is done. The effort was genuine. The result is what it is. There is something to learn for next time, and the person doing the learning is fundamentally intact. The perfectionist cannot rest, because the question of whether the performance was sufficient does not resolve at the end of the project. It just relocates to the next task, the next evaluation, the next opportunity to prove or fail to prove sufficiency. The finish line moves. This is why perfectionism, unlike genuine ambition, is exhausting in a way that does not resolve with success. The goal was never actually the project. The goal was the feeling of safety from judgment. And that feeling, when you understand perfectionism clearly, is not available by achieving anything. It is only available by changing the underlying belief that your worthiness is not on the line. Not now. Not in the project. Not in the result. That is when the light arrives. We are heading there. But before we move forward, here is something worth sitting with a moment longer. Brown is not saying that perfectionism is something to be ashamed of. Many of us developed it in genuinely difficult circumstances. In families where love felt conditional. In schools where performance determined acceptance. In workplaces where showing uncertainty was genuinely dangerous. The perfectionism made sense when it developed. It was a reasonable response to an environment that required it. But the environment changes. You grow. The specific threat that required the original armor has often passed, and the armor stays. Not because you are weak or unaware, but because the body learned the pattern, and the pattern runs faster than the thought. Recognizing this is not self-criticism. It is information. The first step toward letting perfectionism soften is not trying harder to stop. It is understanding what it was trying to protect and recognizing that the protection is no longer as necessary as it once was. That recognition takes time. It takes patience with yourself. It takes the very compassion that perfectionism has spent years directing away from the self and toward the performance. But it is possible, and it begins, like most things worth beginning, with honesty. Chapter 9, Numbing the Tender Self. There is a moment that many people recognize, the end of a difficult day. The low-grade stress that has been running in the background since morning. The feeling of having given more than you had and not quite replenished it. And the reach for the glass of wine. The late-night scroll. The third episode when you had planned on one. The snack that was not really about hunger, The game on the phone that keeps you just distracted enough to stop feeling what was there before you picked it up. Not judgment in this. Not a moral problem to solve. Just a pattern worth understanding. Brown calls it numbing, and she found it everywhere in her research. Not just in the obvious places, not just in addiction, which is its most visible form, but in the daily, ordinary, socially acceptable habits of distraction and escape that most people use to turn the emotional volume down. Keeping busy, overscheduling, working through the weekend so that the feelings never get a turn, the constant low hum of background entertainment so that silence never quite arrives, the instinct to scroll before the day fully lands. These are not moral failures. They are responses to discomfort. Reasonable, understandable, entirely human responses to the ache of being alive in a world that does not always feel safe enough to feel everything. But here is what Brown's research found. And it is the kind of thing that, once you understand it, you cannot quite unknow. You cannot selectively numb emotion. When you turn down the volume on the feelings you do not want, you turn down the volume on all of them. You cannot numb anxiety and keep joy. You cannot numb the ache of longing and keep the warmth of gratitude. You cannot take the edge off fear and leave love intact. The emotional system does not have individual dials for each feeling. It has one dial. And when you push it down to manage the difficult things, everything comes down with it. This is why people who numb heavily often describe feeling flat. Not bad exactly, not in acute distress, just muted. Like the world is slightly behind glass. They have achieved what they were reaching for. The difficult feelings are quieter, but the good ones are quieter too. Think of a night when you finally stopped scrolling, when the phone went down and the room went quiet. And for a few seconds before sleep, something came through. Maybe it was grief about something you have been avoiding. Maybe it was a low, wordless ache about a relationship. Maybe it was something you have been putting off feeling for months. And maybe you reached for the phone again, not because you are weak, because that feeling was genuinely uncomfortable and the phone was right there. But the feeling was still waiting when you woke up. Feelings that are not felt do not disappear. They go underground, and they keep the lights on down there, waiting for a moment when the distraction stops and the door opens. There is something specific about the things we numb toward. Brown found in her research that people were not numbing randomly. They were numbing specifically toward the tender things, toward vulnerability and grief and uncertainty, toward the feelings that required something of them: acknowledgement, expression, willingness to be present without a solution. And in numbing those, they were cutting themselves off from the most essential parts of being alive. Because joy and creativity and love and belonging, the things people most want from their lives, live on exactly the same frequency as the grief and fear and uncertainty that the numbing was designed to quiet. You cannot get to the warmth without also getting to the ache. You cannot arrive at genuine connection while maintaining total control over what you feel. The full experience requires the full range. This is not a demand. It is simply a description of how it works. And knowing how it works, understanding the mechanism, rather than just experiencing the flatness, changes something. Because once you see that the numbing is cutting you off from joy as surely as from pain, the cost of the numbing becomes visible in a new way. It is not just managing discomfort, it is managing yourself out of your own life. And you deserve more than that. Let your breath slow for just a moment. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Nothing needs to be resolved right now. The feelings that have been waiting can wait a little longer. But tonight, maybe we can give them a small amount of room. Not to be solved, just to be acknowledged. Just to say, I know you are there. I am not running tonight. That acknowledgement alone changes something, and it is the beginning of getting back what the numbing took. Chapter 10: Why Joy Feels Dangerous. This one surprises people. Not the difficult emotions, not shame or fear or grief. Those are expected guests in a conversation like this. But joy. Why would joy feel dangerous? And yet Brown found this pattern so reliably in her research that she gave it a name. She calls it foreboding joy. The experience of being in a moment of deep happiness or gratitude or love and finding, alongside the joy, a current of fear, as if the good thing is too good. As if allowing yourself to fully feel it is an invitation to have it taken away. A parent watches their child sleeping. The room is quiet. The child is safe. This is the kind of moment that should feel like peace. And for a second, it does. And then the mind moves to the things that could go wrong, to the fragility of this, to the 1,000 ways this good thing could be lost. The parent does not fully land in the joy. They brace for what comes after it, because somewhere along the way they learned that joy is not safe. That when things feel this good, it is wise to stay a little guarded, a little ready, a little defended against the possibility of loss. This is not paranoia. It is a kind of learned intelligence. People who have experienced significant loss often develop this. You were fully present for something good, and then it was taken. And so the mind learns to maintain a certain distance from joy, just in case. But here is what Brown found in the wholehearted people she studied. They had learned something different. Not that loss was impossible, Not that tragedy could not arrive, but that joy was worth the risk of being fully present for. They practiced what she calls gratitude, not as a performance, not as a list of things to be thankful for that gets read each morning, but as an active, present-tense acknowledgement of what is good right now, right here. In this moment, that will not be identical again, because the alternative, guarding yourself against joy in order to be ready for its loss, means you miss the joy entirely. The loss comes anyway, but you never fully had what you were trying to protect. Bracing for the worst does not prevent it. It just means you did not fully have the good. Think of an evening when something was simply nice. A meal, a conversation, light coming through a window at the right angle. Nothing significant, just a quiet, ordinary, good thing. Did you let it land? Or did something in you hold it at arm's length, already half moving toward the next thing, already slightly protecting against the moment ending? Joy does not ask for certainty. It asks for presence. And presence, the willingness to be fully in the moment without running the risk assessment, is exactly what vulnerability makes possible. Let the next breath come slowly. Notice what the room feels like right now. This is enough. This moment, exactly as it is enough. And if something in you wants to qualify that, to add conditions, to say, yes, but, just notice that impulse without following it. Joy is not a trap. It is not a setup. It is the evidence that there is still something here worth being present for. We are getting closer to understanding why that matters. Chapter 11. The Courage of Uncertainty. The word courage has been used so often in motivational language that it has almost lost its original meaning. Be courageous. Face your fears. Have the courage to succeed. But the original meaning of courage is not dramatic. It comes from a Latin word meaning heart. And in its earliest use, it describes something quite simple: the ability to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. Not to conquer, not to defeat, just to show up honestly, with the whole of yourself. That older meaning is more useful for understanding what Brown found in the people she called wholehearted. They were not fearless. They were not confident in the way we usually mean that word, certain, unshaken, always at ease. They were willing to be uncertain, and that willingness is the specific kind of courage that vulnerability requires, because vulnerability is always uncertain. When you are vulnerable, you do not know what the response will be. When you say the true thing, you cannot control how it lands. When you show the real version of yourself, you are no longer managing the other person's perception. You have let go of the controls. And for most people, that is exactly the thing that feels impossible. We live in a culture that celebrates certainty, that rewards confidence and punishes doubt. That reads visible uncertainty as weakness and visible certainty as strength. But Brown's research found something more nuanced. The certainty was often just more armor. The person who seems unshakably confident is sometimes the person who has built the most elaborate internal infrastructure to protect against the possibility of being wrong or exposed. The certainty is not a sign that fear is absent. It is a sign that the armor is particularly well constructed. The people who lived with the most genuine connection were the ones who had found a different relationship to uncertainty. Not comfort with it exactly, more like acceptance. They had stopped trying to make everything predictable. They had stopped needing to guarantee the outcome before taking the step. They had found a way to act from the heart without waiting for a safety net to appear first. Think of what it would feel like to have a conversation you have been putting off, not the catastrophized version. Not the version where everything goes wrong, just the act of beginning, of walking into the uncertainty and speaking honestly without knowing in advance how it will be received. There is a specific quality of aliveness in that moment, not comfort, but aliveness. The feeling of being truly present, truly in contact with another person, truly yourself. That feeling does not exist in the managed version. In the safe, scripted, pre-approved version of yourself that only shows what it knows will land well. It only exists when you show up with your whole heart without a guarantee. Let the breath move through naturally. Let your hands be soft. The courage we are talking about tonight is not grand. It does not require a stage or an audience or a dramatic moment. It requires something smaller and harder. The willingness, just for tonight, to stop managing so much. To be here genuinely, in the quiet, without the armor fully in place. That is where we are, and there is more to find just ahead. Chapter 12. The Anatomy of Shame. Let us spend some time with shame directly, not to wallow in it, to understand it precisely. Because one of shame's greatest powers is vagueness. It works best when it is not examined, when it is just a low, unidentified feeling that colors everything without being named. Naming it accurately changes things. Brown spent years developing what she calls a map of shame, not because she wanted to study suffering, but because she found that the people who were most able to overcome shame, who were most resilient in the face of it, were the ones who could recognize it clearly. The first distinction is the one we touched on earlier, the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt says, I did something that does not align with my values. Shame says, I am something that does not align with what a person should be. Guilt is about behavior. Shame is about identity. And this matters because guilt, uncomfortable as it is, can lead somewhere productive. It points toward specific repair. It preserves the core sense of self. Shame does not do this. Shame says there is nothing to repair because the problem is not the action, it is the person. Brown also distinguishes shame from embarrassment, which is fleeting and often shared. You trip on a step, the crowd sees, you all laugh. The feeling lasts moments. And from humiliation, which involves being publicly degraded by another person. Humiliation says, I do not deserve this. Shame says, maybe I do. That internal acceptance is what makes shame so damaging. Another piece of the anatomy is this. Shame is intensely relational. It is about how you imagine you appear in the eyes of others, about the fear that if they truly saw you, they would find you wanting. This means shame is fed by silence and secrecy. When shame lives only inside the mind, unexpressed it grows. The internal voice repeats its verdict without challenge. The feared judgment becomes the assumed judgment. The worst interpretation of yourself hardens into something that feels like fact. But when shame is spoken to someone safe without judgment, something changes. The story loses its authority. Not immediately and not completely. But language brings it out of the interior darkness and into a space where it can be examined rather than simply endured. Brown found 3 things that allow shame to move through rather than settle in. The first is recognizing shame when it arrives. Naming the feeling precisely. There it is. That is shame. The second is critical awareness. The ability to examine the message shame is carrying and ask whether it is accurate, whether it is yours or something inherited from someone else, whether the fear beneath it is actually proportionate to what is happening. The third is reaching out, sharing the experience with someone who responds with empathy, not advice, not problem-solving. Just, I hear you, I have felt this too. That reaching out is exactly what shame makes most difficult. Because shame says, if you tell anyone this, they will see what I see. They will confirm the verdict. But almost always, the opposite happens. When the feared thing is spoken, the other person leans forward rather than away, because they recognize it, because they have their own version of it, because shame is, beneath its promise of isolation, an extraordinarily common human experience. Feel the weight of your body for just a moment. Notice your breath moving in and out. This is enough for right now. You do not have to solve anything tonight. Just know that the voice in the dark is not the truth. It is a feeling wearing the mask of a fact, and there is a way through. Chapter 13. Men, Silence, and Armor. This chapter is for the men listening tonight, but it is also for anyone who loves a man, works alongside one, or is trying to understand why some of the silences run so deep. Brown's research uncovered something specific about shame and gender. Not because men and women are fundamentally different as human beings, but because the cultural messages they receive about vulnerability, strength, and what it means to be enough are often significantly different. For men, across almost every context she studied, the shame message came down to one fundamental instruction: do not be perceived as weak, not just in the obvious physical sense, in any sense. Do not need too much. Do not show uncertainty. Do not admit that you are struggling. Do not be too emotional. Do not ask for help before it is absolutely necessary. And certainly, above all else, do not let anyone see you falling apart. The enforcement of this message begins early. Boys learn it from other boys, from fathers and teachers and coaches, from the world that gives approval when they succeed and goes quiet or uncomfortable when they hurt. And so many men become expert at a particular form of armor: silence, not hostile silence, not cold withdrawal necessarily, just the practiced habit of not saying the true thing, of managing emotion inward rather than outward, of handling things privately and presenting only the resolved, capable version. This can look like strength from the outside, from the inside. It often feels like isolation. Think of a man sitting at a kitchen table late at night. The house is quiet. Everyone else is asleep. He has been carrying something for months: a worry about the future, a relationship fraying at the edges, a sense of falling behind that he cannot quite explain. He has not told anyone, not because no one would listen, but because the telling itself feels like a kind of failure, like an admission that he cannot handle this on his own. And handling things on his own has been the only acceptable performance for as long as he can remember. So he sits with it at the table alone. And tomorrow he will put the weight back on and carry it through another day without saying a word. And here is what Brown found in her research. The men who had the most genuine connection, the ones with the richest relationships and the strongest sense of belonging, were not the ones who had the most armor. They were the ones who had found at least one person, sometimes only one, with whom they could be their actual selves, not performing, not managing, just real. And the cost of not having that one person was enormous. Men who carry chronic emotional isolation, who have never experienced being fully known by another person, pay for it in their physical health, their psychological well-being, their relationships, and their sense of meaning. The armor is not neutral. It takes something, and the specific thing it takes is the feeling of being known, not evaluated, not judged, known. There is a particular kind of tiredness in men who have never set the armor down. It is the tiredness we talked about in the first chapter, not the physical kind. The tiredness of being strong for everyone and for no one being strong for you. Notice if there is anywhere in your body holding that particular tiredness right now. There is no instruction here, no demand that you do it differently, just this acknowledgement. You are allowed to not be fine. You are allowed to set it down. At least here, at least tonight, in the dark, where no one needs anything from you. That is not weakness. That, as it turns out, is the beginning of the other thing entirely. Chapter 14. Self-worth before achievement. There is an assumption so widespread that most people have never questioned it, that self-worth is something you build through achievement, through results, through the accumulation of things that demonstrate your value. The degree, the title, the body, the relationship, the house, the respect of people you admire. The assumption is that if you earn enough of these things, the internal accounting eventually shifts. You become enough. You earn your way into worthiness. Brown spent years sitting with this assumption and the people who lived by it, and what she found was both deeply human and quietly heartbreaking. The people who had organized their lives around earning worthiness never arrived. Not because they failed. Some of them succeeded by every measure the culture offered. They got the title, they built the thing, they earned the recognition. And they woke up the next morning with the same assessment. Not enough. Because worthiness is not a destination you can reach by traveling a particular road. It is not a status you earn by accumulating sufficient evidence. It is something much more fundamental and much less negotiable than that. Brené Brown found this in her research with the wholehearted people. What distinguished them was not that they had achieved more or suffered less or lived more carefully. What distinguished them was a prior belief. They believed they were worthy of love and belonging before they had done anything to earn it, not as a reward for good performance, just because they were alive and human and here. This sounds simple. It is perhaps the most difficult thing this conversation will ask you to consider, because most of us were not raised with that belief. We were raised with conditions. You are lovable when you are good. You are valuable when you are productive. You deserve connection when you are giving others a reason to stay. And those conditions become the water we swim in. We cannot see them anymore. We just experience the constant low pressure of needing to justify our place. Think of a woman who has achieved something she worked toward for years. Thursday, the announcement comes. By Saturday morning, she wakes up with the same familiar weight. She had been certain this time it would be different, that this achievement would finally close the gap. But the gap was never about achievement. The gap was about a belief she had been carrying since before she knew what a belief was. And beliefs of that age and depth do not move in response to results. They move in response to a different kind of attention, the slow, patient, sometimes uncomfortable work of recognizing that the conditions were never yours to accept in the first place, that you did not consent to the accounting, that you were worthy before the first grade was given and the first performance was evaluated. Let your hands be open for a moment, palms up if it feels right. This is not a meditation, just a physical gesture toward a different kind of openness. Because what follows from the belief that you are inherently worthy is not complacency. It is not an excuse to stop trying. It is freedom. The freedom to work because you love the work, rather than because you are afraid of what happens if you stop. The freedom to connect because you want closeness, rather than because you need approval. That freedom is where we are going, and the door to it is the belief you may need to reconsider. Here is something worth sitting with before we move on. The scarcity message is not just internal, it is cultural. You did not invent it, you absorbed it through education systems that rank and compare, through workplaces that evaluate performance and reward the top percentile, through the social media environment that presents the highlight reel of every life but your own, and through a very old, very human habit of measuring worth. The cultural scarcity message says, there is not enough success for everyone, not enough beauty, not enough time, not enough recognition. Someone is always falling behind. And when you are part of a culture running this message constantly, it is genuinely difficult to find the internal quiet from which a different belief can grow. This is not a reason to give up on the belief. It is a reason to be patient with the difficulty of holding it. Because you are not just changing an individual thought, you are swimming against a significant cultural current. The people Brown identified as wholehearted were not doing it in isolation. They had, almost without exception, found community. People who shared the commitment to showing up honestly, to practicing vulnerability together, to calling each other back from the scarcity message when it started running too loud. Because belonging, real belonging, is also a resource for the fight against scarcity. When you are surrounded by people who see your worth clearly, the internal accounting becomes easier to challenge. You do not have to create the counter-narrative entirely alone, and the door to it is the belief you may need to reconsider. Chapter 15. Vulnerability is not weakness. We have been sitting with the armor for a while now. The performance, the perfectionism, the numbing, the silence, the scarcity message, the fear of being seen. And underneath all of it, the same thing, the belief that vulnerability is a liability, that openness is exposure, that the soft places in you must be protected at almost any cost. Now let us look directly at the thing the armor is protecting against. because Brown's research points towards something that overturns the entire logic of the protection. Vulnerability is not weakness. It never was. This is not optimism. It is not reassurance. It is a specific finding from years of research with real people living real lives. The people who Brown identified as living with the deepest connection, the most genuine sense of belonging, the most fulfilling creative and professional lives. These people did not succeed by being invulnerable. They succeeded by being willing to be vulnerable. And when she looked closely at what that willingness looked like, it was not dramatic. It was not the public confession. It was not the tearful breakdown. It was smaller and more consistent than that. It was saying, "I love you" first. It was making the call to the friend you had lost touch with without knowing if the friendship could still be found. It was creating the thing, the piece of work, the idea, the offering, and putting it into the world without a guarantee that it would be received. It was asking for help before the situation became a crisis. It was showing up in a conversation as your actual self rather than as the version of yourself that is most likely to be approved of. These are ordinary acts. They happen in ordinary moments, in ordinary lives. But each of them requires exactly the thing that the armor was designed to prevent: the willingness to be seen without a guarantee of how that seeing will land. There are two kinds of tiredness. We talked about them in the first chapter: the tiredness of the body, and the tiredness of having been strong for everyone without rest. This is where the second kind gets named properly. It is the tiredness of chronic invulnerability, of maintaining the performance year after year, of never quite being able to set the armor down in any space with any person, of being entirely capable and entirely alone with the parts of yourself that most need to be known. The remedy is not a dramatic surrender. It is a small, specific act, one honest thing said to one person who deserves to hear it, one moment in which you choose presence over performance, one breath in which you let the real self be in the room instead of the managed one. That is the beginning. And from there, something accumulates, not overnight, but genuinely. Here is what Brown found about the practice of vulnerability over time. The first step is always the most difficult, because you are doing it without evidence that it will be received well. You are moving toward the connection before you know if the connection is there. But each honest step that is met, each moment of real presence that is received with warmth rather than withdrawal, becomes evidence. Not evidence that vulnerability is always safe. It is not always safe. But evidence that the risk is survivable, that the world does not end when the armor comes down, that the person across from you, more often than not, leans forward rather than away. And that evidence, accumulated over time, does something to the fear. not eliminate it, but calibrate it. The fear that was based on an old, unexamined assumption starts to update in response to actual experience. And the actual experience, the lived reality of genuine connection, of being known and staying loved, is the most persuasive argument available. Not an argument made of words, an argument made of moments, small, ordinary, unremarkable moments where you showed up as yourself and the other person stayed. And in the accumulation of those moments, something in you gradually begins to believe what the wholehearted people already knew, that the real version of you is worth showing up with. Let your shoulders drop one more time. Notice the weight of your body. Notice the quiet. You are not in danger right now. There is nothing that requires the armor in this moment. And that means, for just this moment, you can afford to let the real self breathe. We are heading toward what that makes possible. Chapter 16. Anxiety beneath control. Control is interesting. Most people who seek it do not think of themselves as controlling people. They think of themselves as responsible people, prepared people, people who care about doing things well and do not want to leave things to chance. And there is a version of that which is healthy: preparation, care, attention to detail. But beneath a certain intensity of control-seeking, Brown found something consistent in her research. Fear, specifically. The fear of what might happen if things were allowed to unfold without management. And beneath that fear often was vulnerability. The person who needs to control outcomes is usually the person who cannot bear the uncertainty of vulnerability. Who needs to know how the story ends before agreeing to be in the story? Think of someone who rehearses conversations before having them, who runs through the scenarios. Who has thought through the likely responses and prepared answers for each? Who only has the conversation when they feel adequately armored against the possible outcomes? This is not a character flaw. It is anxiety wearing the costume of preparedness. Anxiety tells you that if you control enough variables, you can prevent the thing you fear. And the thing almost always feared is some version of being seen in a way that confirms the unworthiness, being rejected, being found inadequate, being caught without an answer. And so the control becomes elaborate. The preparation never quite feels sufficient. There is always one more variable to account for, one more contingency to plan for, one more possible scenario to prepare against, and the exhaustion of this is real. But it is hard to acknowledge because from the outside, and even from the inside, it looks like diligence. Brown's insight is direct here. You cannot think your way to safety from vulnerability. No amount of preparation can make the uncertain certain. No amount of rehearsal can make connection risk-free. No level of control can guarantee that when you show up honestly, the other person will respond the way you hoped. The control is not protecting you from vulnerability. It is keeping you in a permanent state of preparation for it without ever actually arriving at it. And here is the quiet cost. Connection, real, genuine, felt in the body connection, requires the willingness to act without full preparation, to speak before you have the perfect thing to say, to be present before you have managed all the variables. The control keeps the connection at a careful distance, not because you do not want it, but because the price of full arrival, full presence, is exactly the uncertainty you have been trying to avoid. Let your hands soften. Feel the floor beneath you, or the bed, or the surface where your body rests. You are as safe as you are going to be right now. And safe enough is exactly what vulnerability requires. Not total safety, not the absence of all risk, just enough safety to take the next small, honest step. The question beneath this chapter is not how do I eliminate the anxiety? It is this: what would I do if I stopped needing to know the outcome first? Because here is what Brown found in the lives of the wholehearted people. They did not have less uncertainty than everyone else. They did not have better odds or safer circumstances. The unpredictability of their lives was not fundamentally different from anyone else's. What was different was their relationship to the uncertainty. They had found a way to act from the heart without guarantees, to take the step before the outcome was visible, to begin the conversation, make the attempt, extend the offer, not because they were certain it would work out, but because the alternative was not actually safer. The alternative was staying in the position of preparation forever, preparing to have the conversation, preparing to make the offer, preparing to allow the connection once the risk assessment came out in your favor. And the preparation, however reasonable it felt, was its own kind of loss, because what was being prepared for never arrived. And the life that was waiting for the green light remained quietly on hold. The willingness to act without certainty is not recklessness. It is the recognition that certainty was never actually on offer. We will spend some time with what that makes possible. Chapter 17: Connection or Self-Protection. Every person in every significant relationship faces a choice that is rarely made consciously. Connection or self-protection. Not as a permanent declaration. Not as a once-and-for-all decision, but moment by moment. In the small daily exchanges that either build closeness or quietly erode it. The choice to say the true thing or the easier thing. The choice to stay present in a difficult conversation or to manage it from a distance. The choice to be moved by what moves you or to hold yourself slightly back. And the painful thing that Brown's research reveals is this: we almost always think we are choosing connection. We think we are being present. We think we are in the relationship. But sometimes we are in the managed version of the relationship. The version where we are giving enough of ourselves to maintain the form of connection while keeping the parts that could be hurt safely off stage. Think of two people who have been together for many years. They share a house, shared meals, shared history. They know each other's routines and preferences and patterns. But somewhere in the accumulated years, they stopped surprising each other with the full truth. Not through any dramatic falling out, just through the gradual retirement of the parts of themselves that once showed up unmanaged and unedited. She stopped telling him when she was frightened. He stopped telling her when he felt lost. Not because the love went away, because the vulnerability that the love was built on went slowly underground, and the relationship became something comfortable and hollow at the same time. This is not a failure of love. It is what happens when self-protection gradually wins the small daily choices. Brown describes the deepest fear in relationships not as the fear of conflict, though that is real, but as the fear of disconnection. The fear that if you showed all of yourself, the connection that means most to you would be endangered. And so you manage carefully, protectively, and in the managing, you create the very disconnection you were trying to prevent. The distance you were avoiding arrives anyway through the slow accumulation of unspoken things. This pattern, once seen, is hard to unsee, and it is not comfortable to sit with, because it raises the question of where, in your own life, you have chosen self-protection without fully realizing that is what you were doing. Not in judgment, just in honest recognition. Notice if there is someone in your life to whom you give the managed version more often than the real one. Notice if there is something true you have been holding back because the time is never quite right, or the situation is never quite safe enough. Let that thought be there without needing to resolve it tonight. Here is a useful distinction. Self-protection in relationships does not always look like distance. Sometimes it looks like being overly accommodating, agreeing when you do not agree, laughing at the moment that hurt you, making peace when the honest conversation would serve everyone better. This is not kindness. It is management dressed as kindness. Because the relationship you are managing, the one you are keeping smooth by withholding the true thing, is not the relationship. It is a performance of the relationship. The real relationship is only available when both people are actually in it, with their real reactions, their real fears, their real, occasionally inconvenient, fully present humanity. That does not mean every relationship requires full disclosure. It means that the relationships that matter most deserve the real version of you. That the people you love are worth the risk of being known by them rather than just approved of. And often what you discover when you take that risk, when you bring the real thing into the space between you, is that the other person has been waiting for exactly that. Waiting for permission to be real in return. Sometimes the recognition itself is the first step, and recognition is what we are building toward together. Chapter 18. The Risk of Honest Speech. There is a specific kind of sentence that people delay for years. Not difficult conversations exactly, not confrontations, just honest ones. The moment of saying, "I am not okay with this," or "I have been pretending to be fine for a long time, and I am not," or "I love you and I am afraid of losing you," or "I do not know what I am doing and I am too tired to keep pretending that I do." These sentences carry real risk. Not necessarily the risk of catastrophe, but the risk of being seen, of being responded to in a way you cannot control, of having put something irretrievably true into the space between you and another person. And so we delay. We find the not quite right moment. We decide the other person is too busy right now. We tell ourselves we will say it when the situation improves, when the timing is better, when we have the words exactly right. And years pass. Brown found this consistently. People who describe deep regret about their relationships were often not describing dramatic wrongs done or dramatic wrongs received. They were describing the accumulation of honest things unsaid, the appreciation that went unspoken, the apology that was felt but never delivered, the love that was present but never brought out of the interior and offered directly. And when the regret arrived, it arrived in a particular form. Not, "I wish I had done something differently," but, "I wish I had said the true thing while there was still time." Think of someone sitting beside a hospital bed. The room is quiet. The machines hum softly. The person in the bed can no longer respond in the way they once could. And the person sitting there has things to say that they have been carrying for years. They say them now, into the silence. Not for an answer, for release. For the end of carrying something that was always meant to be put down sooner. The honest sentence does not require a perfect moment. It does not require certainty about how it will land. It requires only the willingness to let the true thing be said before the window closes. And windows always close eventually, not as a dark thought, as a fact that, when fully held, changes the daily calculation about what is worth saying and what is worth holding back. This is what Brown means when she talks about wholehearted living as a practice. Not a state you achieve. A set of daily small choices. The choice to say the thing that is true, not recklessly, not without care for context and relationship and timing, but with the underlying willingness to be honest rather than managed, to offer the real version rather than the safe one. Let the breath slow. There is something worth carrying from this chapter into the rest of your night, not as an instruction. Just a question. Is there something true that you have been holding back that is waiting for you to find the courage to say it? And here is the other side of this question. Is there someone in your life who has been holding something back from you? Someone who may be waiting for a signal, not explicit, just felt, that the honest version of what they carry would be received well. because the invitation to honest speech runs in both directions. When you create the conditions where honesty is safe, when the people around you can sense that your reaction to their real feelings will be presence, rather than withdrawal, you change what becomes possible in the relationship. You become someone people can come to, not to perform at, not to manage, to actually be with. And that quality of being a person others feel safe being honest with is not built through instructions. It is built through example, through being honest yourself, through receiving what others offer honestly without shrinking from it, through the accumulated evidence built over time that in your presence the real thing is welcome. Brown calls this building shame resilience in relationship, the practice of creating connections where the honest thing can be said and received. It does not happen all at once. It grows slowly in the small acts of mutual honesty that each make the next slightly easier. You do not have to say it tonight, but you can acknowledge that it is there. That acknowledgement alone is a kind of beginning. Chapter 19. Empathy against isolation. There is a distinction Brown draws that is worth spending some time with. The distinction between empathy and sympathy, because they look similar from the outside. Both involve responding to someone who is struggling. Both involve care. Both involve the intention to help, but they work in entirely different directions. Sympathy looks down at the person in the hole. It sees the struggle from a safe distance. It offers something from that distance. Well, at least. Or, you should try. Or, look on the bright side. The sympathy is genuine, but it keeps the space between the two people intact. It offers help without entering the vulnerability. Empathy climbs down into the hole. It does not arrive with a solution. It arrives with a presence. It says, I know what it is like in here. I have been in a version of this. You are not alone. And the experience of that, of not being alone in the difficulty, of having someone come toward you rather than managing you from a distance, is one of the most powerful experiences a human being can have. Brown found that empathy is the specific antidote to shame, because shame lives in the belief that you are uniquely deficient, that the thing you are ashamed of is proof of something specifically wrong with you that does not apply to everyone else. And when someone responds with empathy, when they say, without judgment or advice or silver linings, I have felt that too, the isolation of shame breaks. Not because the problem is solved, but because the belief that you are alone in it is revealed as false. This matters because so many people carry their most difficult things in complete isolation. Not because help is unavailable, but because asking for it feels like confirming the very unworthiness they are afraid of. If I tell you I am struggling, you will see what is wrong with me. You will confirm the verdict. But almost always the opposite happens. When the struggled with thing is spoken to a safe person, what comes back is recognition, not judgment, not withdrawal. Just, I see you, I hear you, I have been there. Think of a person who finally speaks the true thing to a friend they trust, the thing they have been managing quietly for a long time. The fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of not having it together in the way everyone seems to assume they do, and the friend says something small and true. Something like, I had no idea you were carrying this. I wish you had told me sooner, because I have been carrying something similar and I thought I was the only one. That moment, the relief in that moment, is not just emotional comfort. It is a neurological event. The nervous system registers the shift from isolation to connection, and something in the body loosens. This is what Brown means when she says connection is why we are here, not in a romantic or abstract sense, in the deeply biological sense that we are wired for it, that its absence costs us, and that its presence restores something essential. Let your jaw soften for just a moment. Notice the breath moving in and out. The conversation we are having tonight is a small version of this. An invitation to be in the company of these ideas without the performance, without the managed version. Just here, in the quiet, being with what is true. Brown makes a specific distinction about empathy that is worth holding. Empathy does not require you to have had the identical experience. It requires you to find the feeling in yourself that resonates with what the other person is describing. When someone tells you they are terrified about something in their life, you do not need to have faced that specific thing. You need to find the place in you that knows what fear feels like, and to speak from there. When someone tells you they feel invisible, unseen, unvalued, like they do not matter, you do not need to have experienced it in the same way. You need to find the place in you that knows that ache, and to stay there with them rather than rush to fix it. This is why empathy requires vulnerability from the person offering it. You have to be willing to go somewhere in yourself, to find the resonant feeling and not keep it at a managed distance, to actually arrive in the experience with the other person rather than observing it from a careful remove. And that willingness to be moved by what moves the other person, to be affected by what affects them, is itself a form of the connection we have been describing all night. Not the response that keeps the distance, the response that closes it, and that is not nothing. Chapter 20, Belonging Without Betrayal. There is a distinction Brown draws that many people find clarifying in a painful way: the difference between belonging and fitting in. Fitting in is something most people have been practicing since childhood. You assess the group, identify what is valued and what is not, and adjust accordingly. You present the version of yourself most likely to be accepted. You earn your place by being what the group seems to want. And this works, in a way. You get included, you avoid the rejection. You do not stand out in the wrong ways. But it costs something. Because fitting in, at its core, requires you to leave some part of yourself outside the room. Belonging is different. True belonging, as Brown defines it, is the experience of being accepted not despite who you are, but because of who you are. Being in a group or a relationship where you do not have to leave any part of yourself at the door to be welcomed. And here is the hard finding. True belonging requires vulnerability because you cannot be accepted for who you are if you never show who you are. Fitting in can happen behind a mask, but belonging requires the mask to come down. This means that fitting in is, paradoxically, the enemy of belonging. When you constantly adjust and edit and manage in order to be accepted, you never find out whether you yourself are acceptable. You only find out whether your performance is acceptable. And the loneliness of fitting in perfectly while never truly belonging is a particular and profound kind of ache. Think of someone who has always been good at fitting in. They read rooms well, they know how to calibrate, they are easy company, they get along with everyone, and they feel profoundly alone. Not because they are doing it wrong, but because no one in any of those rooms has ever actually met them. They have only met the version of them that was calibrated to be acceptable. Brown talks about belonging as the deepest human need. And she adds something specific to what makes it possible. Belonging to yourself first. Before the group can accept you as you are, you have to be willing to show up as you are. And that requires a kind of internal belonging, a prior sense that who you actually are is worth being. Not perfect, not finished, not free from doubt or difficulty, but worth being. That is the belief that makes real belonging possible. And it is also the belief that the scarcity culture and the shame voice work hardest to undermine. Something changes when you stop trying to earn your way into belonging. We said this earlier. Now we can name what changes. You stop performing for the room. You start looking for the room where you do not need to perform. And that room is not always easy to find, but it exists, and you cannot find it while you are still wearing the mask. There is a specific kind of loneliness that the people who are very good at fitting in often feel. It is not the loneliness of being excluded. It is almost the opposite. It is the loneliness of being included as someone you are not, of being in the room, welcomed in the room, laughed with and valued and invited back, and still feeling, underneath all of that, a hollow distance, a sense that the warmth you are receiving is for the performance rather than the person. Brown found this pattern consistently. People who had spent decades getting very good at reading what others wanted and adjusting accordingly, who had been rewarded for that skill, appreciated for it, even loved for it, and who felt privately utterly unknown, not because the people around them were incapable of knowing them, but because they had never offered the real thing to be known. The mask had been on for so long that they had half forgotten what was underneath it. And the work of belonging, the real work, the work that creates the connection that actually satisfies the hunger, requires going back to find that. Not as a dramatic revelation, as a slow, patient return to the self that exists when nothing is being performed, to the version that holds the feelings that did not make it into the presentation, to the person underneath the person you show the world. That person is worth knowing. And there are people in your life who, given the chance, would choose to know them. Let the weight of your body rest where it is. Let the breath come and go. The room we are in tonight requires nothing from you. That is not nothing. That is the beginning of what belonging actually feels like. Chapter 21. Love without performing. Love is one of the things most people perform without knowing they are performing. Not in the early stages, perhaps. In the beginning, there is often a real and unrehearsed quality to the connection. The other person is new. The territory is not yet mapped. You are genuinely uncertain how they will respond, and so you are genuinely present. But gradually, as the relationship becomes familiar, something else arrives. The performance layer, the careful management of how you are seen by the person you love most, the instinct to present your best self, to keep the difficult things quiet until you have handled them, to be the version of yourself that deserves to be loved rather than the version that simply is. And the quiet tragedy of this is that the performance distances you from exactly the thing you are performing to protect. Think of two people who have been together for years. They know each other's patterns. They know how the other person reacts to certain subjects. And slowly, without either of them deciding this, certain subjects have become off-limits. Not through a fight or a rule, just through the accumulated learning of what causes friction. She does not tell him about the fear. He does not tell her about the loneliness. They are kind to each other, comfortable with each other, and they miss each other, not in the dramatic way, in the quiet, persistent way of people who share a life but have drifted to separate interiors. Brown's research touches something precise about intimate relationships. The deepest connection, the love that feels like coming home, like being known, like the specific relief of not having to perform, is built not on showing the best version of yourself, but on being willing to show all of it. The uncertainty alongside the confidence, the fear alongside the strength, the tenderness underneath the capability. Not as a dramatic revelation, as an ongoing practice of small honesty. I am not okay today. I am scared about this. I need you to know this about me, even though I would rather manage it on my own. These small sentences, offered across years, build something that performance cannot build. Real intimacy, the experience of being loved for what you actually are. And here is what makes that experience different from every other kind of being loved. You know it is real. Because you did not earn it by presenting a version of yourself calculated to be lovable. You received it while being your actual self. And the receiving of love in that form, not as a reward for excellent performance, but as a response to your actual presence, is one of the most stabilizing experiences human being can have. It says, "You, as you are enough." Not as an idea, as evidence. This is important because many people have heard the idea. They have been told they are lovable. They have been told their worth is inherent and not conditional. But the telling, without the experience, does not fully land. The belief changes when the experience confirms it. When you show the real version, the uncertain version, the struggling version, the version that holds the parts you have been most careful to keep off stage, and the person who receives it stays and looks at you with the same warmth as before. That moment is not just comforting, it is corrective. It contradicts the old belief at the level of experience, which is deeper than the level of idea. You knew intellectually that you might be lovable as you are. Now you have felt it, and felt things change things in a way that known things do not. This is why Brown describes vulnerability not just as connection's birthplace, but as its ongoing practice. Not a thing you do. Once, dramatically, and then return to the managed version. But a small, daily, sustainable practice of letting a little more of the real self into the room. Not as a performance of authenticity. Just as a regular return to what is actually true, not as an idea, as evidence. Let your breath slow. Notice if something in you resists this idea. That resistance is worth noticing, because wherever there is resistance to the idea of being loved as you are, there is often the old belief still running, the one that says you need to earn it first. We are working quietly on that belief tonight. Chapter 22, Parenting Without Perfection. This chapter is for parents, but it is also for anyone who was once a child, which means everyone here. Brown's research on parenting reveals something that is both relieving and uncomfortable in equal measure. The thing children need most from their parents is not perfection. It is not achievement. It is not the absence of failure or conflict or difficulty. It is not the presentation of a parent who has everything managed and under control. What children need most is authentic connection. They need to see in the person raising them a human being who feels things, who makes mistakes, who recovers from those mistakes, who apologizes, who tries again. A person who demonstrates through daily living that the full range of human experience, including difficulty and uncertainty and failure, is survivable and does not have to be hidden. Brown describes this as the vulnerability of parenting. We often try to protect our children from our own struggles. We believe, with real love behind the belief, that showing them our difficulties will frighten them or burden them or undermine their sense of security. But children are extraordinarily sensitive to the gap between what they are told and what they sense. When a parent says everything is fine in a tone that carries another meaning entirely, children do not hear the words. They feel the atmosphere, and they absorb from that gap a particular lesson. Feelings need to be managed. The difficult ones are not for public consumption. If something is wrong, the appropriate response is to present okay. They do not learn this from a lecture. They learn it from watching. And then they grow up and wonder why it is so hard to be honest about what they are actually feeling. What authentic parenting looks like is not confessional. It is not unburdening yourself onto your children. It is not performing vulnerability as a teaching moment. It is smaller than that. It is saying, in a way appropriate to the moment, I was scared about that too. Or, I made a mistake today and here is what I am going to do about it. Or, I do not always have the answers, and that is true for everyone, including me. It is holding your child and meaning it rather than holding your child from behind the performance. Think of a grandparent sitting on the floor of a living room with a small child. Toys scattered around. And the child, out of nowhere, asks, "Were you ever scared?" The grandparent has a choice. The easy answer, the managed answer. Something reassuring and closed. Or the honest one, yes, many times. And then the child settles closer because something in the honest answer says, your fear is not shameful, it is human. It is something that grandparents carry too and survive. That gift, the gift of honest humanity shared between generations, is something no performance can provide. Let the breath move through naturally. The work of being human is passed from person to person, not through instructions, but through example. What you model for the people who are watching you, the ones who are still learning what it means to be alive, is more powerful than anything you could say. And what they need most from you is not the perfect version, it is the real one. Chapter 23. Leadership without armoring up. There is a version of leadership most people have been taught: decisive, certain, in control. The person in the room who always has the answer and never shows the doubt. This version of leadership has a long cultural history. It is drawn from military models, from hierarchical structures, from the idea that the person at the top must project invulnerability in order to maintain confidence and order. Brown's research challenges this model directly, not from sentiment, from evidence. She found that the most effective leaders, the ones who built the most genuinely engaged teams, the most creative organizations, the most resilient cultures, were not the ones who had the most armor. They were the ones willing to be vulnerable in very specific ways. There is a particular quality of presence that some leaders have. It is not charisma exactly. It is not the ability to hold a room or deliver a compelling speech. It is something quieter. It is the quality of being genuinely in contact with reality, with what is actually happening, with how people are actually feeling, with the situation as it is rather than as they need it to appear. And that contact is only possible when the armor is not fully in place, when the leader is willing to be seen, to not have all the answers in the room, to say, I do not know yet. Let us think about this together. That quality, the willingness to be present and uncertain at the same time, creates something in the people around them. Permission. Permission to also be present and uncertain. To bring the real problem forward rather than the managed version. To trust that honesty will be received without penalty. And from that permission, genuinely creative, genuinely collaborative work becomes possible. Not because the leader was vulnerable in some performative way, but because their authentic presence gave others permission to be authentic in return. That is leadership through connection rather than through armor, and it builds something that armor never can. She found that the most effective leaders, the ones who built the most genuinely engaged teams, the most creative organizations, the most resilient cultures, were not the ones who had the most armor. They were the ones willing to be vulnerable in very specific ways, to say, "I do not know. Let us figure this out together." To say, "I made a call and it was wrong. Here is what I am learning from that." To say, "This is hard and I am going to be honest with you about how hard it is." Not as weakness, as trust. Because what armor in leadership actually communicates is not strength. It communicates distance, inaccessibility, the message that honesty is not safe in this environment. And when people feel that the honesty is not safe, they stop offering it. They tell the leader what the leader seems to want to hear. They manage upward rather than engaging genuinely. The information the leader most needs, the real picture, the difficult feedback, the problem that is growing before it is visible at the top, stops flowing. The armored leader ends up isolated from reality by the very armor they thought was protecting their authority. Brown describes a specific kind of courage required in leadership. The willingness to have the conversation before you are fully certain of the outcome. To invite real feedback and then stay present with what comes back. To admit the uncertainty without abandoning the responsibility. This is not comfortable leadership, but it is effective leadership in the deepest sense. Think of a moment when someone in a position of authority over you said something honest about their own difficulty. Not as an overshare, just as a recognition that the situation was genuinely hard and they were genuinely uncertain. Did that undermine your confidence in them, or did it deepen it? For most people, authentic honesty in leadership deepens trust. It says, this person is in contact with reality. They are not performing for us. We can trust that what they tell us is what they actually believe. That trust is the foundation of a culture where people bring their full capability rather than their managed performance. And full capability is where creative work, genuine problem-solving, and real resilience are built. Let your breath settle. Notice the quiet of this moment. The most powerful thing a person in a position of influence can do is also the most ordinary thing. Show up. Be honest. Stay present. Not with a script, with themselves. Chapter 24. The Myth of Invulnerability. There is a cultural story about invulnerability. The person who has mastered their emotions, who feels but is never swayed, who can be in the most difficult situations and remain perfectly composed, perfectly functional, perfectly above it all. This story is in the movies, in the public figures who are held up as ideals, in the unspoken standards of many workplaces and families. It says, this is what emotional maturity looks like. This is what strength looks like. This is what arriving looks like. Brown's research is clear on this. The person this story describes does not exist, and the attempt to become that person is one of the most damaging projects a human being can undertake. Not because feeling things is good and numbness is bad in a simple moral sense, but because the suppression of emotion is not the same as the management of emotion. And the cultural confusion between these two things has cost an enormous amount of human well-being. Managing emotion means feeling the feeling, naming it, and making a considered choice about how to act on it. Suppressing emotion means not feeling it at all, or believing you are not feeling it while it continues to do its work underground in the body, in the decisions you make without knowing you are making them. The person who has successfully suppressed emotion is not calm, they are tight. There is a difference between stillness and suppression, between peace and numbness, between genuine equanimity and the very careful performance of not needing anything. And here is what makes this distinction difficult to live with. Suppression works. In the short term, in the managed term, it works very well. The feelings that were inconvenient are no longer visible. The vulnerability that threatened to show does not show. The performance is maintained, but the body does not forget. What the mind suppresses, the body records. The feelings do not disappear because they are unexpressed. They settle somewhere deeper, into the way the shoulders hold themselves, into the quality of the breath, into the low-level vigilance that feels like personality but is actually a nervous system that never received the signal that the threat has passed. The path forward is not a dramatic confrontation with everything that has been held. It is gentler than that, and slower. But it begins with this recognition. The feelings are not your enemy. They are information. And you are safe enough to start listening. There is a difference between stillness and suppression, between peace and numbness, between genuine equanimity and the very careful performance of not needing anything. Brown talks about the cost of the invulnerability myth specifically for the people who believe they have achieved it, because the feelings do not go away. They just go elsewhere, into the body, into patterns of behavior that the person does not consciously choose, into the way they respond to perceived threats, into the quality of their sleep, into the second kind of tiredness. Think of a person in their late 50s who has spent a career being the strong one, the capable one, the one who handles things. And now, in the early hours of a quiet morning, they find themselves unable to say what they feel, not because nothing is there, but because the faculty for knowing what is there has rusted from years of disuse. The feelings are present, but the language for them and the permission to have them have been so long withheld that the territory is unfamiliar. This is what the myth of invulnerability costs in the long run. Not just connection with others, connection with yourself. The ability to know what you actually feel, what you actually need. What is actually happening in the interior life that runs beneath the performance. And that self-knowledge is not a luxury. It is the navigational system you need to make choices that are actually your own. Let your hands be soft. Feel the weight of your body and the breath moving through. The feelings that have been waiting are not enemies. They are information, and you are safe enough to start listening. Chapter 25: Burnout and Emotional Distance. Burnout is not what most people think it is. The common understanding is that burnout is about working too much, doing too much, the simple overloading of the system with too many demands. And that is partly true. The practical dimension is real. Chronic overwork without recovery is genuinely harmful. But Brown's research, and the broader research on burnout she draws from, identifies something additional. Burnout is also what happens when the emotional effort of performance goes unchecked for too long. When you are not just doing too much, but being too much for too long. Maintaining too many versions of yourself across too many contexts. Keeping too many performances running simultaneously without enough space to simply be nothing for a while. Think of a man who has kept busy for years. The workshop always has a project. The calendar is always full. The weekends are structured. The evenings have a plan. People admire his energy. Nobody asks what he is keeping the busyness out. Until one Sunday there is no plan, and the silence is suddenly very loud. And something he has been successfully managing around for years surfaces in that silence and will not be scheduled away. The busyness was not ambition. It was anesthesia. This is the form of burnout that is hardest to recognize, because it does not look like collapse. It looks like productivity. It looks like dedication. It looks like the life of someone who has their priorities in order. But underneath, the emotional distance grows. The gap between the performed self and the actual self widens. The feelings that were not allowed to be felt accumulate in the body. The nervous system, which has been running in a sustained stress response for so long, starts to make decisions on its own. Small things feel overwhelming, large things feel numb. Relationships that should feel close feel oddly far away. This is emotional burnout. And it is extremely common, especially in the demographic most likely to be listening tonight. The people who have been capable for a long time, who have carried things for a long time, who have been the steady ones, the reliable ones, the ones who do not need much. Brown's research suggests that the recovery from this kind of burnout does not happen through rest alone, through sleep and vacation and less on the calendar. It happens through reconnection to the feeling life that was put aside, to the relationships where you do not have to perform, to the parts of yourself that you set down years ago because they were inconvenient and have not had a reason to pick back up. It happens through vulnerability, through allowing, in small and sustainable ways, the real self to breathe. Let the breath slow. Notice where in your body you carry this particular tiredness. Not to fix it tonight, just to know where it lives. Because the first step toward the reconnection that heals is simply knowing that something needs to be reconnected, and you already know. You have known for a while. Chapter 26. Therapy, Trust, and Repair. There is still, in many places and many lives, a stigma around asking for help. Not dramatic help, not crisis help. Just the ordinary human act of sitting with another person and saying, "There are things happening in here that I cannot see clearly on my own." Brown herself describes seeking therapy, not as a last resort, not after a collapse, but because she arrived at something in her research that she needed to sit with in a way she could not do alone. What she found in therapy was not what she expected, not a tidy revelation, not a moment when everything made sense, but something more useful and more lasting, a relationship, a safe space, a person who could hold what she brought without flinching, without rushing towards solution, without managing the discomfort from a careful distance. The thing therapy offers, at its best, is not expertise applied to a problem. It is the experience of being fully seen by another person and not found wanting. The therapist who sees the thing you are most ashamed of, who receives the part of you that you have been most careful to keep off stage, and responds with steady, undefended presence rather than withdrawal or judgment. That experience, repeated across time, is not just helpful, it is corrective. It does not just teach you that you are acceptable, it gives you the experience of it. And the experience, felt in the body, changes the belief in a way that argument alone cannot. Think of a woman who has spent years being self-sufficient, who has been proud of her independence, her ability to handle things without needing to bring them to anyone else, who has equated needing help with being insufficient. She sits across from a therapist for the first time. She has a list. She is prepared to be efficient. The therapist asks, "What would you say to yourself right now the way you would speak to a dear friend?" She opens her mouth and stops. She realizes she has never tried. She knows how to speak to others with warmth and care. She has no idea how to speak that way to herself. That gap between the compassion she extends easily outward and the harshness she directs inward is precisely what therapy can begin to close. Not through instruction, through relationship. And here is what is important beyond therapy specifically. The qualities that make therapy healing, the non-judgmental presence, the willingness to hold difficulty without rushing to fix it, the experience of being seen without being evaluated. These qualities are not exclusive to the therapeutic relationship. They can exist in friendships, in marriages, in the relationship you have with yourself. The work of building these kinds of relationships is part of what Brown calls shame resilience. The practice of having people in your life who have earned the right to see you struggle, who have demonstrated that they can receive your difficulty without retreating or managing. That circle might be small. It might be one person. It might take time to build or rebuild, but its existence changes the entire experience of being alive. Let the breath slow. Let the weight of the body rest. You do not have to carry everything alone. That was never actually required of you. It only felt like a requirement. Chapter 27. The stories shame tells. Shame is a storyteller, and it is a very specific kind of storyteller. It does not tell stories about what happened. It tells stories about what happened means. You made a mistake. Shame does not say you made a mistake. Shame says this is the kind of person you are. You struggled with something. Shame does not say that was genuinely difficult. Shame says other people do not struggle with this. This is about something specifically wrong with you. You were rejected. Shame does not say that rejection hurt. Shame says you were rejected because you were never worthy of the connection to begin with. The stories shame tells are precise in one way and imprecise in every other. They are precise in their targeting. They always hit the most vulnerable belief you carry about yourself. They always find the deepest version of the fear, but they are wildly imprecise in their accuracy because they are not derived from careful observation. They are derived from the oldest wound, the most formative fear, the message you received before you had the vocabulary to question it. The story shame tells about you is not neutral journalism. It is partisan. It is looking for evidence to confirm a verdict that was rendered long before the current situation ever arose. Think of a person replaying a conversation at midnight. Something small happened earlier in the day. A colleague said something in a meeting. A quick remark, perhaps not even intended critically. But the replay is not neutral. The mind interprets the remark, then interprets the pause that followed it, then interprets the body language in the room, and by midnight, the mild awkwardness of a single professional moment has become evidence for the sweeping narrative. You do not belong here. You are always a step behind. People have noticed. None of this is necessarily true, but shame is not interested in truth. It is interested in confirmation. Brown's work on shame resilience includes something she calls story awareness, the practice of noticing when shame is narrating rather than describing, the difference between something difficult happened today and I feel hurt by it, and something difficult happened today, and it proves everything I have ever feared about myself. The first is a feeling. The second is a story. And once you can see the story, as a construction rather than a fact, you have the capacity to question it, not to eliminate it. Shame does not disappear because you have named it, but to hold it differently, to say, there is shame here telling a story. I know what this story is, I know where it comes from, and I am not required to believe it just because it is familiar. Let your breath slow. Notice the jaw, the hands, the shoulders. The story shame tells you is very old, but you are not the same person who first heard it. You have been growing past it for longer than you know. Chapter 28, Boundaries with an Open Heart. There is a particular confusion that runs through many conversations about boundaries. The idea that boundaries and openness are opposites. That having good boundaries means being closed, cautious, self-protective in ways that limit connection. Brown's research suggests the opposite is true. The people in her studies who had the most genuine, open, warm-hearted connections with others were also the people who had the clearest sense of what they would and would not accept. The most generous people were often the most boundaried. And this is not coincidence. Resentment is what happens when you say yes when your whole self was saying no, when you agree to something because the discomfort of declining felt greater than the discomfort of doing it, when you take on more than you can carry because disappointing someone felt unbearable, when you give from a place of fear rather than a place of genuine desire, and the resentment that accumulates from this pattern does not stay contained. It bleeds into the relationship where you said yes too many times, into the way you show up for the people who have been given the leftover version of you, the depleted version, the one who has been generous in all the wrong directions and has nothing left. Boundaries are not about hardness. They are about sustainability. They are about knowing what you can give genuinely versus what you give from depletion and resentment. They are about protecting the conditions under which you can actually show up wholeheartedly rather than performing generosity you do not have. Think of a moment when you said no to something, not from cruelty or indifference, from an honest recognition of your own limit. The guilt arrived immediately. That guilt is real, and it is worth understanding, because the guilt is not necessarily a sign that you did the wrong thing. It is often a sign that you were trained at some formative point that your needs and limits were less important than other people's comfort with you. The guilt is the old training recognizing itself being overridden, and overriding it is not selfishness. It is the beginning of genuine generosity, the kind that comes from fullness rather than from fear of being found insufficient. Brown describes boundaries as an act of respect. Respect for the relationship, for the other person, and for the person you need to remain in order to show up well. A boundary says, I value this relationship enough to be honest about what I can and cannot give. I value myself enough to honor my own limits. That is not closing the heart. That is how the heart stays open. Brown uses a phrase that is useful here. She describes the most generous people she studied as having what she calls generous boundaries, not permissive limits, the kind that say yes to everything and then withdraw the warmth when the resentment accumulates, but clear limits, the kind that say honestly what can and cannot be given, and then give that thing fully. The difference in the relationship is enormous. When you give from a place of clarity about what you can genuinely offer, the gift is real. There is no debt attached to it, no hidden resentment waiting to surface, no eventual invoice for the giving that was done from depletion. When you give from depletion, the gift is complicated. It arrives with the full weight of what it cost you. And sooner or later, the person receiving it feels that weight. Brown found that the most genuinely generous people were also the ones most willing to say no, because they had learned the connection between honest limits and sustainable giving. They knew that they could only offer warmth from fullness. And fullness requires protecting the conditions that maintain it. Boundaries are the container that makes genuine generosity possible. That is, not closing the heart. That is how the heart stays open. Let the breath come and go naturally. Notice if there is anywhere you are giving from depletion right now, not as a problem to solve tonight, just as something to know, because what you know, you can work with. Chapter 29, Wholehearted Living. We have traveled through a great deal of territory tonight. The armor, the performance, the shame and the scarcity and the fear of being seen, the perfectionism and the numbing and the stories that run in the background. Now we can name what we have been moving toward. Brené Brown calls it wholehearted living, and it is not a destination, not a state of perfection, not the absence of fear or difficulty or the messy, unresolved parts of being human. It is a way of engaging with the experience of being alive. Specifically, it is the daily practice of choosing connection over protection, of showing up as you actually are, even when the performance version would be safer and smoother, of allowing yourself to be fully present in the life you are living rather than in the managed, edited, armor-adjacent version of it. The wholehearted people Brown identified were not people who had everything figured out. They were not free from shame or fear or the inner critic or the late night self-doubt. What distinguished them was a set of practices, not a set of achievements. The practice of rest and play without justification. The practice of creativity and gratitude and connection to something larger than the daily accounting. The practice of letting go of perfectionism in favor of genuine effort. The practice of trusting themselves enough to set the armor down in the places where it was safe to do so. And, perhaps most importantly, the practice of believing in their own worthiness. Not because they had earned it, not because they had finally achieved enough or managed enough or performed well enough to warrant it, but as a prior assumption, a starting point. I am worthy of love and belonging, not because of what I do, because of what I am. Remember the two kinds of tiredness we mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, the tiredness of the body and the second kind, the tiredness of having been strong for everyone without rest, of performing the capable version for so long without any space to simply be. The second kind of tiredness does not heal through sleep. It heals through what we have been describing, through small, sustainable acts of genuine connection, through the experience of being known rather than just seen, through the practice of showing up as yourself in at least some places some of the time, through the belief, however tentative, that you are enough to be worth knowing. And here is where something that was planted at the beginning of this conversation resolves itself. Something changes when you stop trying to earn your way into belonging. What changes is this. You stop asking the question, am I enough? And start living from the answer, yes. Not perfectly, not without doubt. Not without the days when the armor goes back on because the situation requires it or the fear is too loud. But underneath all of it, as the ground, as the starting point, yes, you are enough. You were enough before tonight, you will be enough tomorrow. Let that land somewhere in the body, not as a resolution to achieve, as something already true. Here is what the wholehearted people did that distinguished them from the people who spent their lives searching for worthiness. They did not wait. They did not wait until they had fixed the difficult parts. They did not wait until the inner critic went quiet. They did not wait until the fear of being seen had fully passed. They began from a prior assumption of worthiness and lived outward from there. This did not mean they were free from doubt. Brown is very clear about this. It meant that the doubt did not have the final word. The inner critic was still present. The scarcity message was still audible. The old fears still arrived on difficult nights. But underneath those fears, as the ground rather than as the ceiling, was a different belief. I am worthy of love and belonging, not because I have earned it, because I am here, because I am alive, because I am human and trying and imperfect and real. And from that ground, the daily work of being alive, the connections and the creative attempts and the honest conversations and the willingness to show up becomes something other than a strategy for earning worthiness. It becomes an expression of it. That is the shift. Not a dramatic one, not a permanent one, free from backsliding, but a real one. Not as a resolution to achieve, as something already true. Chapter 30. Grief, Tenderness, and Courage. There is a kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with fanfare or certainty. It arrives in ordinary moments that most people would not call courageous at all. The moment you let yourself cry about something you have been holding back. The moment you allow the tenderness to show through the toughness. Not because the toughness failed, but because it is not the only thing you are. The moment you grieve something small. Brown found in her research that the people who lived most fully were not the ones who had learned to avoid grief. They were the ones who had learned to move through it. Not quickly, not efficiently, not with a schedule for completion, but honestly, with the willingness to actually feel the loss rather than manage around it. Think of a Tuesday afternoon when something simply overflows, no single cause. The accumulated weight of something you have been carrying finally tips past manageable into real. The tears that arrive on a random Tuesday without warning for no single reason, not a crisis, just a release. The body keeping its own calendar, releasing what has been held. This is not weakness. This is the body doing exactly what it needs to do. And the courage is not in the tears. It is in allowing them, in not reaching immediately for the phone or the task or the joke, in giving the grief, however wordless and small, the few minutes it needs to move through. There is a Japanese art form called kintsugi. When a ceramic piece breaks, the cracks are filled with gold rather than hidden. The repaired piece is considered more beautiful, not less, for having broken. What has broken in you is not waste. Brown describes grief and tenderness as the specific emotions that most people in her research had spent the most effort avoiding. Not because they were weak, but because they were the most vulnerable emotions, the ones that most clearly required the armor to come down. And in the avoidance of grief, something was lost. Not just the processing of specific losses, but the capacity for full feeling, because the same wall that keeps grief out keeps joy out. The same management that holds tenderness at bay holds warmth at bay. The full range of emotional life requires the willingness to be fully in it, including the difficult parts. The grief is not the enemy of the good life. It is the evidence of how much you have loved and how much has mattered. Let your breath slow now. Let the weight of the body settle. Is there something you have been holding back from feeling? Not to answer out loud, just to notice. The tenderness beneath the capable self is not a liability. Think of the Japanese art of kintsugi. When a ceramic bowl breaks, The traditional response in this practice is not to discard it or to hide the damage. The cracks are repaired with gold. The lines of the break become part of the beauty of the piece. The repaired bowl is considered more beautiful, not less, for having broken and been put back together. The philosophy behind this practice says something quiet and important. The damage is not the end of the story, it is part of the story. And the repair, done honestly rather than hidden, becomes the most interesting part. This is what grief makes possible, not immediately, not without cost, but eventually. The person who has truly grieved something, who has allowed the loss to be a loss rather than managing it into something smaller, has something that the person who avoided it does not. Depth, the full range of experience that comes from having been all the way down somewhere and having found their way back. And from that depth, a particular kind of warmth becomes available. A warmth for other people in difficult places. A recognition, a capacity to sit with someone in their difficulty without needing to fix it or rush them through it, because you know the terrain. Grief is the price of having loved, and the price, when truly paid, leaves you more capable of love than when you started. It is the part of you that knows how to love, and that is the most essential part of all. Chapter 31, Imperfection as Home. Here is a thought that might feel uncomfortable at first. What if imperfection is not a problem to be solved, not something to be improved toward, worked through, or eventually transcended? What if it is simply the condition of being alive? Brown calls the embrace of imperfection one of the central practices of wholehearted living, and she means it precisely. Not as resignation, not as an excuse to stop trying, but as an honest reckoning with what is actually available. The flawless life was never an option. The perfect self was always a construction. The version of you that has everything together and never struggles and always responds correctly and never says the wrong thing or feels the wrong thing or gets it wrong in the ways you most fear getting it wrong, that version does not exist. And the effort to become it, or to perform it convincingly enough that no one notices the gap, is one of the most energy-consuming projects a human being can undertake. What happens when you put the project down? Not dramatically, not by abandoning care or effort or the genuine desire to do better, but by releasing the specific expectation of perfection, by allowing the ordinary, flawed, trying and sometimes failing version of you to simply be the actual version of you. Brown talks about this as coming home to yourself, because the imperfect self is not a lesser version. It is the only version. The other one was always a story. And stories require constant maintenance. The real thing only requires presence. Think of looking at your own face in a mirror, not as evaluation, just as observation. The face that has been through years, that carries the evidence of difficulty survived and joy experienced and time passing. The lines that the performance self might want smoothed away, they are not flaws. They are the record of having been here. They are what a life that was actually lived looks like. Imperfection as home means accepting that place, not with resignation, but with the specific relief of no longer pretending, of saying, "This is who I am." Trying, flawed, sometimes afraid, sometimes brilliant, most of the time somewhere ordinary in between. And being ordinary in that way, genuinely, fully ordinary, without the performance of extraordinary, is where rest lives. It is where the second kind of tiredness finally gets to set down what it has been carrying. Let the breath move slowly through. Let the body be exactly as it is. There is nothing to improve in this moment. Brown describes wholehearted people as having what she calls a strong back and a soft front. The strong back is the groundedness, the values, the sense of self that does not require external validation to remain intact. The soft front is the openness, the willingness to be affected, the capacity to be moved by what is genuinely moving without needing to manage that from behind armor. Most people have one or the other. The person with the strong back but no soft front becomes impenetrable, steady but unreachable. They have values but not vulnerability. They have conviction but not genuine contact. The person with the soft front but no strong back is easily overwhelmed. They feel everything so intensely and without structure that the feeling becomes its own kind of chaos. They are present but unmoored. The wholehearted combination, grounded enough to hold your shape, open enough to be touched, requires both the groundedness and the openness. And what makes that combination possible is the acceptance of imperfection as the foundation, not striving toward imperfection, not celebrating failure, but accepting that the whole self, the trying and failing and learning and imperfect self, is the self, not a draft, not a work in progress toward a final, finished, acceptable version. The draft is the final version. The imperfect is the real, and the real is more beautiful than any performance. There is nothing to improve in this moment. You are home. Chapter 32. Atlas of the Heart. One of the things Brené Brown returned to again and again in her later work is the question of language. Specifically, what happens when you do not have words for what you feel? Her research suggests that the absence of emotional vocabulary is not a minor inconvenience. It is a significant obstacle to the kind of self-awareness and connection that wholehearted living requires. If you cannot name what you feel, you cannot process it, you cannot share it, you cannot ask for what you need in response to it. You are left with only the sensation, which, without language, becomes a diffuse and undefined distress. This is one of the reasons many people describe their inner life as just complicated, just a lot, just hard to explain. Not because the feelings are genuinely beyond description, but because the vocabulary was never fully developed. Brown's later book, Atlas of the Heart, is essentially a map of human emotion. An attempt to give precise language to the distinctions between feelings that are often collapsed together and thereby misunderstood. Consider the difference between sadness and grief. Grief is specifically about loss. It has a referent. Sadness is broader. Feeling them as the same thing means you might treat grief like ordinary sadness, wait for it to pass without processing what was actually lost. Consider the difference between anger and humiliation. Both may arrive after being treated badly, but they require different responses. Anger wants acknowledgement and repair. Humiliation wants witness and restoration of dignity. Treating humiliation like anger, responding with confrontation, may escalate something that needed instead to be held. Consider the difference between belonging and fitting in, which we touched on earlier. The confusion between them has cost many people years of performing acceptance while experiencing isolation. Words matter here, not in an academic sense. In the lived, practical sense that you can only navigate what you can see, and you can only see what you can name. This is not about building a sophisticated vocabulary to impress anyone. It is about having access to your own interior life, about being able to stop in the middle of a difficult moment and say, what is actually happening in here? Not just fine, not just bad, but what specifically? And then to follow that naming somewhere useful toward the specific thing you actually need. Let your breath come and go. Notice what is present right now. Not just tired or okay, something more specific. Is there relief in the quiet? Gratitude for the stillness? Something between sadness and peace that does not have a single word but lives in the body as a particular warmth? That is enough. The language does not have to be perfect. The naming does not have to be precise. Just the practice of turning attention inward with honesty and without performance. That practice alone changes the relationship between you and what you carry. Brown identifies over 80 distinct human emotions in Atlas of the Heart. 80. Most people, when asked, can name about 3. Happy, sad, and angry. And that limited vocabulary is not a minor inconvenience. It is a genuine limitation on self-knowledge. When your emotional vocabulary is small, every uncomfortable feeling gets collapsed into one of a handful of categories. And those categories do not tell you enough to act well. There is a difference between anxiety and anticipation. Both involve a kind of heightened readiness toward an uncertain future. But anxiety is oriented toward threat. Anticipation is oriented toward possibility. They require different responses. There is a difference between envy and admiration. Both involve a strong response to someone else's qualities or achievements. Envy wants what they have and resents that they have it. Admiration is inspired by what they have and hopes for something similar. Acting on envy damages relationships. Acting on admiration can build them. There is a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the ache of unwanted disconnection. Solitude is the chosen and nourishing aloneness. They feel entirely different in the body. They require entirely different responses. When you can make these distinctions, when your emotional vocabulary grows, you are not just smarter about your feelings, you are more free, because you can navigate more precisely toward what you actually need. That practice alone changes the relationship between you and what you carry. Chapter 33, Daring Greatly at Midnight. There is a speech that Brené Brown returns to often in her work. A speech made by Theodore Roosevelt in 1910 inches Paris. It contains a single passage that, Brown argues, captures something essential about vulnerability and courage. Roosevelt described the person in the arena, not the critics in the cheap seats, not the spectators watching from safety, but the person who is actually in it, who has the courage to try the thing, who stumbles, who falls, who gets back up, who enters the arena again with no guarantee of winning and no protection from failure. What strikes Brown about this image is what Roosevelt says about the critics. They do not matter, not because their opinions are wrong, but because they are not in the arena. They have not taken the risk of showing up. They have not put themselves in the position of being seen and possibly failing. Their critique comes from a place of safety that disqualifies them from judging the person who chose the harder path. And at midnight, many of us are our own harshest critics. The voice that reviewed the day and found it wanting, that catalogued the stumbles, that counted the ways the performance fell short. That voice is sitting in the cheap seats. It did not take any of the risks that the day required. It did not show up in the difficult conversation, in the hard meeting, in the moment when you were uncertain and said something anyway. It did not write the email, make the phone call, reach toward the person who might not reach back. You did all of that in the arena. And the voice in the cheap seats does not get to be the final word. Daring greatly is not about winning. It is about being in it, about choosing presence and honest effort over the safety of the observer's position. And here, at midnight, the question is not whether you performed perfectly today. The question is, were you in the arena? Did you show up? Did you try the true thing, even imperfectly? Did you let something real into the day, however briefly, however slightly? If the answer is yes, then you have already done the hard thing. You already dared greatly in whatever small, unwitnessed way the day allowed. Think of a moment today when you said something honest, or tried something uncertain, or stayed present through something uncomfortable rather than retreating into the managed version. Maybe it was a very small thing. Maybe no one noticed but you. It counted. Every small act of genuine presence counts. Every moment of showing up without the full armor. Every tiny choice of connection over protection. These are the building blocks of the wholehearted life, not the grand gestures. The ordinary daily acts of courage that accumulate into something real. Roosevelt's arena speech was written about political courage, about the person who steps into public life and accepts the scrutiny that comes with it. But Brown found it applied far more broadly than that. Every person has their arena. For some, it is the professional world. For others, it is the creative work they have been afraid to share. For others, it is the relationship they have been afraid to fully enter. For others, it is the conversation they have been drafting in their head for months. The arena is wherever you are being asked to show up as yourself with no guarantee of how it will be received. And the common human impulse is to stay outside the arena, to watch from the safety of the critic seat, to maintain the comfortable position of someone who has not risked anything and therefore cannot fail at anything. Brown is direct about what that position costs. Not failure, not pain. Not the specific loss you were trying to avoid. The loss of aliveness. Because the arena is where the genuine experience of being alive is concentrated. The uncertainty and the effort and the possibility of falling and the experience of getting back up, that is not what happens in the cheap seats. The cheap seats are safe, and they are quietly deadening. The arena is risky, and it is where the life actually is. Let the weight of your body rest. Let the breath come slow. You were in the arena today. That is enough. Chapter 34. Letting ourselves be known. There is a difference between being seen and being known. Being seen is about surface. It is what other people observe. The performance, the achievement, the image, carefully curated or casually presented. Being known is something different. It is what happens when someone has access not just to the surface, but to the interior. When they know not just what you do, but why. Not just how you appear, but what you are afraid of, and what you love, and what you carry in the quiet hours. Being known requires more than being visible. It requires being honest about what is actually there. And most of us have been seen by many people and known by very few. Not because the people around us were incapable of knowing us, but because we never fully let them in. Not out of deception, out of the very reasonable, very human, very understandable fear that being fully known was also the most efficient route to being fully rejected. Because if you show only the best version and the relationship is strong, the armor stays. You have love, but you have it as the performed self. You do not know if the actual self is equally lovable, and the not knowing, unexamined, becomes its own kind of loneliness. Think of a night where you felt a sudden warmth towards someone. Not romantic necessarily, just the feeling of, this person actually knows me. I am not performing for them. They have seen the less polished version and they stayed. That warmth is not ordinary. That warmth is the nervous system registering something it has been waiting for. Real safety, real connection, the particular relief of being known. Cone. Brown describes this as the deepest human hunger, deeper than achievement, deeper than comfort, the hunger to be in the company of someone who knows the full picture and loves it anyway, not in spite of the imperfection. Because of the honesty that the imperfection represents, because the person who shows you their actual self is giving you something the polished performer cannot give. Trust. The willingness to be known is an act of trust in the other person, and the experience of being held in that trust, of receiving someone's genuine self and holding it with care, is one of the most meaningful experiences available. This works in both directions. Letting yourself be known and allowing yourself to truly know someone else. Both require vulnerability. Both require showing up without the script. Both require the willingness to be in the uncertain space where real connection lives. Let the breath be slow. Notice the weight of your body, the stillness of the room. Is there someone in your life who knows you, really knows you, beyond the performance? If the answer is yes, let yourself feel the quiet gratitude in that. If the answer is no, let that be an honest recognition rather than a verdict, because the recognition is the beginning, and every small movement toward letting yourself be known is a movement toward the thing you most need. We are almost at the end now, and what is waiting there is quiet. Chapter 35. Rest beyond performance. We have been traveling through Brené Brown's ideas for a long time tonight, through the armor and the shame and the fear of being seen, through the ways we protect ourselves, through the ways that protection costs us, through what becomes possible when we set it down. Now we arrive somewhere different, not at an idea, at a practice, not something to think about, something to feel. So let us try something gentle together, not a meditation, not an exercise. Just a moment of letting the ideas settle into the body, where they can do more than be understood. Take your attention to wherever your body feels heaviest right now. Maybe your legs, maybe your hands, maybe the back of your head resting against the pillow or the cushion or wherever you have settled tonight. There is nothing to change. Just notice. You have been carrying things today, this week, for years probably, in the quiet and persistent way that the body carries what the mind manages. Let your breath find its own rhythm now. Not deeper, not slower on purpose. Just let it move the way it wants to move. If your mind is still busy with the day or with the ideas we have been exploring, that is fine. Let it be busy in the background. Like a television in another room, heard but not watched. Right now, your only task is to feel the weight of your body, to notice that you are here, that you are breathing, that you are, in this moment, exactly as safe as you need to be. You do not need to perform anything here. Not rest, not peace, not the correct response to a philosophical conversation about vulnerability. Just let whatever is present be present. If there is tiredness, let it be tired. If there is something unresolved from earlier in the day, let it be unresolved for now. If there is something like relief in the quiet, let that land. Brené Brown spent years studying what it means to be fully alive. And what she found beneath all of the research and all of the framework and all of the carefully mapped emotional territory was something simple. The fully alive person is not the person with the most armor, not the person with the most achievements, not the person who has outrun their own vulnerability and arrived at some state of invulnerable completion. The fully alive person is the one who is present to what they feel, present to the people they love, present to the imperfect, unfinished, genuinely human life they are actually living rather than the ideal version they have been trying to perform. And rest, true rest, is not the absence of feeling, it is the absence of performance. The moment you stop trying to be anything other than what you are in this moment, let that settle. You are not performing right now. You do not have to. The armor can stay right where it is, off to the side, for just a little while longer. And notice what the body does when there is nothing to hold up, when there is nothing to protect and nothing to prove and nowhere better to be than here. This is rest, not earned, not scheduled, just available. It has always been available. And whenever you are ready, whether that is in 5 minutes or 5 hours, it will still be here. Let the next breath come on its own. You are held. Chapter 36. A quiet return to worthiness. At the beginning of tonight, we sat with a particular image. The exhale. That moment after the door closes and the performance ends and something in you finally lets go of the breath you did not know you were holding. We have come a long way from that image and we have returned to it. Because everything Brown spent her career studying comes back to a single question. Not a complicated question. The kind that sounds simple and takes years to answer. Am I enough? And the answer, she found, is not something you arrive at by doing more, achieving more, performing more convincingly, or managing more efficiently. The answer is prior to all of that. You are enough because you are here, because you are alive and feeling and trying and imperfect and real. Not theoretically, not as a comfort or a platitude, as the starting point from which the rest of the life is lived. Worthiness is not a reward. It is not something you earn with sufficient evidence or accumulate over time through demonstrated value. It is the ground, and the work of wholehearted living is not the work of building that ground. It is the work of clearing away what has covered it. The layers of conditioning and performance and armor that were laid down before you had the words to question them. The ground was always there. We have been sitting with what has been covering it before you sleep. Tonight, we are going to spend the final minutes of this conversation together. 7 days, 7 gentle practices, not demands, not requirements, just an invitation to carry something small from tonight into the days ahead. Day 1, listen to the voice. Tomorrow, simply notice how you speak to yourself, not to change it, just to hear it. Is the tone kind? Is it harsh? Is it the voice of someone who believes in your worthiness? Or the voice of an old accounting that was never yours to accept? You do not need to change anything tomorrow. Just listen. That awareness is enough. Day 2. One kind sentence. At some point in the day, say one kind thing to yourself, out loud or silently. Something like, I am doing my best, and that is real. It will feel unfamiliar. Say it anyway. The awkwardness is not a sign it is wrong. It is a sign it is new. Day 3. Forgive something small. Choose one small thing from recent days that the inner critic has been keeping on the ledger. A mistake. A moment that did not go well. Something you wish you had handled differently. Release it, not the big things yet, just a small one. Practice at a scale where it feels possible. Day 4. Rest without justification. Take 10 minutes today to do nothing productive. Not rest so you can be more productive later. Just rest. Because you are a human being and not a machine. Notice the guilt. If it comes, let it pass. You are allowed to stop. Day 5. Ask what you need. When something is difficult today, pause for a moment and ask, what do I actually need right now? Not, what should I do? What do I need? Water, a moment of quiet, a conversation, permission to say no. Let the answer surprise you. And then, if you can, give yourself the thing. Day 6, accept something kind. If someone says something generous to you today, a compliment, an expression of gratitude, a simple acknowledgement of your effort, resist the impulse to deflect or minimize. Just say, thank you. Let it land. You do not need to have earned it. You just need to receive it. Day 7. Sit with the quiet. Tonight, before sleep, sit or lie in silence for 2 minutes. No phone, no sound, just you in the dark. Let whatever comes, come. You do not need to make this meaningful or productive. You just need to let it be quiet. And trust that quiet, with nothing to perform and nothing to prove, is already enough. These are not steps to a destination. They are small, daily, sustainable acts of treating yourself as someone worth knowing, someone whose feelings are worth feeling, someone whose rest is worth taking, someone whose imperfect, trying, genuinely alive presence in the world has value, not because of the performance, but because of the reality. The armor that you wore into this evening does not have to be abandoned. You will need it sometimes. The world asks things of us that require it. But here, in the quiet that is settling around you now, it can rest. And underneath it, as it always has been, is the thing that Brené Brown spent her career pointing toward. A person who is worthy of love, not conditionally, not eventually, not after sufficient achievement or adequate performance or enough years of getting it right. Now, in the dark, with the breath slowing, with the day finally behind you, you, exactly as you are, is enough. Let the next breath come on its own. Let the room be quiet. Let what was held tonight, slowly, gently, find its way to rest. You are held. Sleep now.